Welcome to the Story Atelier, where every story opens a door to profound lessons and powerful emotions. Today, we bring you a tale that will captivate you from start to finish, a story of courage, resilience, and the fight to change a flawed system. Picture this: you are a highly respected attorney, driving your brand new car through the quiet streets of your own neighborhood. Suddenly, flashing red and blue lights appear in your rearview mirror. You're pulled over, accused of being a criminal, not because of what you've done, but simply because of how you look. What happens when prejudice challenges everything you've worked for? How do you respond when the very justice system you've upheld turns against you? And can one person stand up against injustice and spark real change? This isn't just one man's story, it's the story of Oliver Hayes. A man who turned humiliation into action and injustice into a rallying cry for an entire community. Join us as we dive into this gripping and emotional journey, and discover what happens when one person refuses to stay silent in the face of injustice. Imagine being a high-ranking attorney driving home through the serene streets of your suburban neighborhood, only to find flashing blue and red lights tailing you. Despite your spotless record and years of upholding justice, you're pulled over, accused of a crime you didn't commit, all because of an assumption. This is the beginning of Oliver Hayes' ordeal, a man who would soon become the face of a fight against injustice. Oliver adjusted the tie he had loosened hours earlier after finishing a grueling day at the prestigious Moorfield County Courthouse in Pennsylvania. His brand new, midnight blue BMW purred softly as it cruised down Maple Grove Lane. The neighborhood was picturesque, lined with towering oaks and quaint, well-maintained homes. It was a place of peace. Or so Oliver thought. The jazz station playing on his radio was abruptly drowned out by the wail of a siren. His heart skipped a beat as the cruiser's lights danced across his rearview mirror. Confused, Oliver slowed down and pulled to the side. He hadn't been speeding, and his car was fully insured and registered. Is this some mistake? He thought, keeping his hands visible on the steering wheel. A shadowy figure approached, the beam of a flashlight cutting through the dusk. The officer, a burly man with sharp features and a name tag reading, Officer Dempsey, tapped on the window with an air of authority. License and registration, Dempsey barked. Oliver complied, his calm demeanor unshaken, and handed over the documents. What seems to be the problem, officer? Oliver asked, his tone even. Dempsey scanned the papers but barely looked at Oliver. This car matches the description of a vehicle reported stolen a few days ago, he said curtly. This car? I purchased it just last week, Oliver said, incredulous. The dealership paperwork is in the glove compartment. But Dempsey wasn't interested in explanations. Step out of the car. Oliver hesitated. Officer, I assure you, I said out. Dempsey's voice rose, his hand hovering near his holstered weapon. Taking a deep breath, Oliver unbuckled his seatbelt and stepped out, his movements slow and deliberate. As he stood by the side of the car, the officer ordered him to place his hands on the hood. The humiliation was sharp, but Oliver complied, conscious of the eyes peeking through the curtains of nearby homes. Dempsey began a rough pat-down, his questions pointed and accusatory. What are you doing in this area? Do you live here? Oliver clenched his jaw but answered calmly, I'm on my way home. I live 2 blocks down. Dempsey smirked, the suspicion in his eyes unmoved. We'll see about that. As the situation escalated, Oliver decided to assert his identity. I'm Oliver Hayes, a senior attorney at Moorfield County Courthouse. Perhaps you should contact your department and confirm. Dempsey paused for a fraction of a second, then barked into his radio, requesting a check on Oliver's name and car registration. The tension in the air was palpable as they waited. The silence was broken only by the static crackle of the radio and the rustling of leaves in the evening breeze. Finally, a voice on the other end confirmed Oliver's identity. Dempsey's demeanor shifted slightly, his face flushing with a mix of embarrassment and defiance. "Looks like there's been a misunderstanding," he muttered, stepping back. "A misunderstanding?" Oliver's voice was steady but laced with indignation. "You profiled me, officer. This isn't just about my car." Before Dempsey could respond, another police car pulled up. Captain Miriam Ward, the precinct commander, stepped out, her expression a mix of professionalism and concern. "Mr. Hayes, I deeply apologize for this incident," she said. "Rest assured, this will be thoroughly investigated." Oliver nodded, his composure intact, but the sting of the encounter lingered. As Captain Ward ushered Dempsey back to his cruiser, Oliver climbed into his BMW, his mind racing. This wasn't just about him. It was a symptom of a larger issue, one he could no longer ignore. That night, as Oliver recounted the incident to his wife, Evelyn, her outrage mirrored his own. "You can't let this slide, Oliver," she said firmly. "You've always fought for justice in the courtroom. Now it's time to fight for it here." Oliver agreed. What had happened to him wasn't isolated, and he knew there were others who wouldn't have the resources or the voice to challenge such treatment. This incident would be the catalyst for change, not just for him, but for his community. Oliver Hayes spent the weekend reflecting on his encounter with Officer Dempsey. It was a glaring reminder of a systemic issue he had often seen in the cases he prosecuted: implicit bias leading to injustice. The more he thought about it, the clearer it became: this wasn't an incident he could ignore. He had spent years fighting for fairness in the courtroom. Now it was time to extend that fight beyond its walls. By Monday morning, Oliver had already crafted a plan. He made calls to a few trusted colleagues, community leaders, and local journalists. He wasn't just going to lodge a complaint, he was going to start a conversation. And so, the seeds of change were sown. The following Friday evening, the Hayes living room was filled with a diverse mix of people: lawyers, activists, teachers, and even a few residents who had heard about Oliver's ordeal through word of mouth. Evelyn had set out coffee and pastries, creating a warm but serious atmosphere. "Thank you all for coming," Oliver began, standing at the front of the room. His voice carried the calm authority he was known for. "I want to share what happened to me last week, not because I'm looking for sympathy, but because it's part of a much larger problem." He recounted the story with precision, leaving out no detail. Gasps and murmurs of agreement punctuated his words, especially when he described the humiliation of being patted down in his own neighborhood. "This isn't just about me," he said, his tone firm. "It's about a system that allows this to happen to anyone who looks like me. And if it can happen to me, as an attorney with resources and connections, what about those who don't have the same privileges?" Maya Torres, a young activist seated near the fireplace, spoke up. "Oliver, you're absolutely right. We've been trying to address these issues for years. But people don't listen until someone with your stature speaks out. What are you thinking we should do?" Oliver nodded. "We need to take a multi-pronged approach. First, I'll file an official complaint against Officer Dempsey. But we can't stop there. We need to educate law enforcement, bring the community and police together, and start holding officers accountable when they act out of line." Pastor Samuel Green, a respected elder in the community, added, "I've seen too many young men from our church profiled like this." "Whatever you decide, Oliver, you'll have my full support. But we need to approach this with wisdom and grace." The meeting lasted late into the night. with attendees brainstorming ideas, sharing personal stories, and planning next steps. By the end, they had decided to hold a town hall meeting, inviting residents and local officials to discuss the relationship between the community and the police. It would be an opportunity to turn anger into dialogue and dialogue into action. The following week, flyers announcing the town hall appeared on community bulletin boards, local coffee shops, and online forums. The event was scheduled to take place at the Moorfield Community Center, a neutral and central location that symbolized the unity they hoped to foster. On the evening of the meeting, the community center buzzed with energy. Rows of chairs faced a small stage where a panel of speakers, including Oliver, Pastor Green, and a representative from the police department, would address the crowd. As people filed in, Oliver scanned the room. He recognized neighbors, teachers, small business owners, and even a few students from the local high school. But his attention was drawn to the group of uniformed officers standing near the back, including Officer Dempsey and Captain Ward. When the meeting began, Pastor Green opened with a prayer, calling for understanding and healing. Then, he introduced Oliver, who stepped up to the microphone. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Oliver began, his voice steady. "What happened to me last week is just one example of a broader issue. But instead of letting this divide us, I believe we can use it as an opportunity to come together and find solutions." He spoke passionately, sharing not only his story but the stories he had heard from others during the past week. His words were met with applause, nods of agreement, and even a few tears. When Captain Ward took the stage, she acknowledged the tension in the room but expressed her commitment to improving the relationship between the police and the community. "We've made mistakes," she admitted, "and we have work to do. But we can't do it alone. We need your voices, your input, and your partnership." However, the meeting wasn't without conflict. When Officer Dempsey was called upon to address the room, his defensive tone quickly sparked murmurs of discontent. "I was following protocol," he insisted. "I had a report of a stolen car, and I did my job." "But did you listen?" Oliver asked, standing from his seat. The room fell silent. "When I told you who I was and showed you proof, did you consider that you might have made a mistake? Or did you assume I was lying because of how I look?" Dempsey hesitated, his eyes darting toward Captain Ward for support. The silence spoke volumes. By the end of the night, tensions had begun to ease, replaced by a cautious sense of hope. The event closed with a commitment from Captain Ward to implement training on implicit bias and increase community engagement efforts. Meanwhile, Oliver and the others pledged to hold the department accountable for following through. As the crowd dispersed, Maya approached Oliver. "That was powerful," she said, "but this is just the beginning. Are you ready for what's next?" Oliver nodded, his expression resolute. "This isn't just a fight for me. It's a fight for all of us. And I won't stop until we see real change." The momentum from the town hall meeting carried through the following weeks. Oliver Hayes became a symbol of justice and accountability in Moorfield, with local newspapers and online blogs covering his story extensively. What started as a personal ordeal had now become a community movement. But with attention came scrutiny and resistance. One brisk morning, Oliver sat at his kitchen table, reviewing the emails pouring into his inbox. Some were messages of support from strangers who had experienced similar profiling incidents. Others were less kind, accusing him of stirring up trouble or undermining the police. "Look at this one," he said to Evelyn, sliding his laptop across the table. She skimmed the message, her brows knitting together. "It's a veiled threat," she said. "Stay in your lane." "Hayes, who writes something like that?" Oliver leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. People who don't want the truth coming out. He said quietly, but I'm not backing down. Evelyn placed a reassuring hand on his arm. You're not alone in this. Don't forget that. The following day, Oliver attended a meeting with Captain Ward and her team at the police precinct. It was an uneasy gathering, the tension in the air thick enough to cut with a knife. Among the officers present was Officer Dempsey, his expression a mixture of defiance and unease. We've reviewed the incident report from that evening. Captain Ward began, addressing Oliver. It's clear that mistakes were made, and we take full responsibility for that. As a department, we're committed to rebuilding trust. Oliver nodded, acknowledging the issue is a start. Captain, but we need more than words. The community needs to see action. Captain Ward gestured to a projector screen where a series of initiatives were outlined. They included mandatory training on implicit bias, regular town hall meetings, and a civilian oversight board to review complaints against officers. It's not perfect, Ward admitted, but it's a framework. We hope to refine it with your input. Oliver studied the screen, his lawyerly mind dissecting every detail. It's a step in the right direction, he said after a moment. But implementation will be key. The community will hold you accountable. As the meeting ended, Dempsey approached Oliver, his expression guarded. Look, he hesitated, the words catching in his throat. I didn't mean for things to escalate the way they did. Oliver met his gaze, searching for sincerity. It's not about what you meant, Officer Dempsey. It's about what you did. And it's about making sure it doesn't happen again. Dempsey nodded slowly, his shoulders slumping slightly. I'll think about that. Meanwhile, the ripple effect of Oliver's advocacy began to surface in unexpected ways. Maya Torres organized a series of workshops to educate the community about their rights during police encounters. Pastor Green hosted forums for residents to share their stories, turning pain into solidarity. Even Evelyn found herself drawn into the movement, coordinating volunteers and managing communications. However, not everyone welcomed the changes. A small but vocal group began to organize against Oliver's efforts, claiming that the new measures were anti-police and divisive. Their leader, a local businessman named Grant Phelps, accused Oliver of undermining law enforcement and stirring unrest. One evening, as Oliver left the courthouse, Phelps confronted him outside. "Hayes," Phelps called, striding toward him with a self-assured gait. "You've got some nerve." Oliver turned to face him, his posture calm but firm. "Mr. Phelps, if you have something to say, I suggest you say it plainly." Phelps smirked. "I'll say it plainly. All right. This little crusade of yours? It's tearing this town apart. You are making enemies. Hayes, powerful ones." Oliver squared his shoulders. "If calling out injustice makes me enemies, so be it. I didn't start this fight, but I intend to finish it." Phelps' smirk faltered, replaced by a cold glare. "Be careful, Hayes. People don't take kindly to having their lives disrupted." Oliver watched as Phelps walked away, his words lingering like a shadow. He knew the fight for justice wasn't without risk, but he hadn't expected the opposition to become so personal. The breaking point came a week later when Maya called Oliver in a panic. "Someone vandalized the community center," she said, her voice shaking. "Graffiti all over the walls. They wrote, 'Stay quiet or else.'" Oliver's jaw tightened as he gripped the phone. "I'll be there in 10 minutes." When he arrived, a small crowd had already gathered, their faces reflecting a mix of anger and fear. The walls of the community center were defaced with threatening messages in bold red spray paint. "This is intimidation," Oliver said, addressing the group. And we're not going to let it stop us. Maya nodded, her determination shining through her anger. We'll clean this up and keep moving forward. They want to scare us into silence. But we won't give them that power. The group worked late into the night, scrubbing the walls clean and repainting over the damage. It was a moment of unity, but also a stark reminder of the obstacles they faced. As Oliver drove home that night, his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "You are pushing too hard. Back off, or you'll regret it." He stared at the message, a knot of unease forming in his chest. The threats were escalating, but so was his resolve. He knew the path ahead would be treacherous, but he also knew the stakes were too high to turn back now. Oliver Hayes awoke to the sound of his phone buzzing incessantly on his nightstand. The sun had barely begun to rise, casting a pale glow through the curtains. Groggily, he grabbed the phone and squinted at the screen. It was Maya Torres. "Oliver, turn on the news. Now," she said, her voice taut with urgency. He fumbled for the remote and switched on the television. The screen lit up with the local news anchor standing in front of Moorfields City Hall. "This morning, shocking revelations have come to light about systemic corruption in the Moorfield Police Department," the anchor announced. Documents leaked overnight detail extensive bribery and cover-ups involving high-ranking officials and local businesses. Oliver's heart raced as images of the documents flashed on the screen. He recognized them immediately. These were the files he and his group had painstakingly compiled. Someone had gone public, but it hadn't been him. Later that morning, Oliver met Maya and Pastor Green at the community center. The room buzzed with activity as volunteers fielded phone calls and reporters gathered outside. "It was Aaron," Maya said, referring to a young journalist who had attended their town hall meeting weeks earlier. "He took the files and leaked them anonymously. The media's running with it." Oliver felt a surge of conflicting emotions. On one hand, the truth was finally out. On the other, the manner of its release had put everyone involved at greater risk. "This changes everything," he said, "but it also means they'll retaliate. We need to be prepared." The fallout was swift and chaotic. By midday, Moorfield streets were filled with protesters demanding accountability. The leaked documents implicated not only Officer Dempsey but also several senior officers, including Captain Ward, who had been aware of misconduct but failed to act. Businesses tied to Grant Phelps were also named as participants in the corruption, fueling public outrage. That evening, Oliver addressed the crowd from the steps of the courthouse. His voice carried through the cold night air, clear and resolute. "This is not just about a few bad actors," he declared. "This is about a system that has allowed corruption and injustice to thrive. But today, we have taken the first step toward dismantling that system. And we will not stop until justice is served." The crowd erupted in cheers, their energy palpable. Yet Oliver knew the fight was far from over. The next day, Oliver received an unexpected call from Captain Ward, who had stepped down amidst the scandal. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her tone subdued, "I owe you an apology. I should have done more. I should have stopped this before it got this far." "Captain Ward, acknowledging your mistakes is a start," Oliver replied, "but actions speak louder than words. If you truly want to make amends, help us rebuild." There was a pause on the other end of the line before Ward spoke again. "I'll do whatever I can." As the days turned into weeks, investigations were launched, arrests were made, and reforms were enacted. Officer Dempsey resigned in disgrace, while Grant Phelps was indicted on charges of bribery and fraud. The Moorfield Police Department underwent a complete overhaul, with new leadership committed to transparency and fairness. Despite these victories, The threats against Oliver and his allies continued. Late one night, his phone buzzed with another anonymous message. "This isn't over." Evelyn, sensing his growing exhaustion, sat beside him and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You've done so much already, Oliver. Maybe it's time to step back." But Oliver shook his head. "We've come too far to stop now. This isn't just about me, it's about the future of this town." The final turning point came during a televised hearing where Oliver testified before a state oversight committee. Flanked by Meyer and Pastor Green, he laid out the systemic issues that had plagued Moorfield and called for statewide reforms. "I stand here not as a victim, but as an advocate for change," Oliver said, his voice steady. "We cannot allow our institutions to fail the people they are meant to serve. Justice is not a privilege, it is a right." His testimony resonated far beyond Moorfield, sparking similar movements in neighboring towns and cities. Months later, as Oliver stood outside the newly renovated community center, he reflected on how far they had come. The walls that had once been defaced with threats now bore a mural painted by local artists, depicting unity and resilience. Evelyn stood beside him, holding his hand. "You did it," she said softly. "No," Oliver replied, his gaze sweeping over the bustling street filled with smiling faces. "We did it." As the sun set over Moorfield, Oliver felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The road ahead would still have its challenges, but for the first time, he truly believed in the power of community to create lasting change.